Hi, members. My name's Lesley Jones, for those who don't know me. I am the archives manager, and I'm also in charge of a lot of things outside of the live streams here. I do internships, I do events, and I run the front desk. So if you ever come by, just come say hi. Otherwise, I'd like to talk to you about my thesis that I'm working on at University of North Georgia, and it's called Home is Where the Haunt Is, the Cultural History of the Domestic Seance in Victorian London. I think it's a really interesting topic, spiritualism, not only because it's ghosts and all that, but it's also a big movement in the 19th century that a lot of people don't recognize. What is spiritualism? Obviously, it was communicating with the dead. Here we have Maggie and Katie Fox. Maggie is the one on the left. Katie is the one in the middle. Leah is the one on the right. That's their sister. She became their tour manager. So Katie and Maggie Fox were kind of bored one day at their home in Rochester, New York, and they decided that they were just going to pull a prank on their parents, and they said that there was a ghost in their house. And the mom believed it and kind of went a little bit ballistic. She brought in her friends, she brought in a family, she brought in everyone she could to hear the ghosts. And what Katie and Maggie did was essentially start the modern spiritualism movement. There was communication with the spirits before then, but it was more in the Middle Ages when it wasn't frowned upon or considered black magic. But here they started it, and they started at a very early age. I think one was 8 and one was 12. They started at a very early age doing table wrappings, which we will talk about that process in a little bit. So something I wanted to talk about was, why did spiritualism succeed when it did? Before this time, the Middle Ages was when they talked about ghosts, about death, about mourning. After that, it wasn't really something that they talked about. It was kind of heresy, black magic kind of things. So why did spiritualism succeed in America and Britain when it did? I would say it has to do with all of the unfortunate deaths and diseases that were going on at the time. For example, the American Civil War, it was the largest war going on in America at the time. There was in Britain the Crimean, Boer, and Opium Wars, and just to name 3 large ones, but there were many in the 19th century. There was a ton of pandemics going on, as you see there, a lot. Child mortality rates was 462.9 per 1,000 births. And in Britain, they had the crisis of faith. In the crisis of faith, the Christian church was being questioned because of everything going on with the rise in technology, with the conversion of Protestants and Methodists. There was a lot going on religiously in the 19th century, including the Industrial Revolution. The rise of technology, especially electricity, which we'll talk about, is one of the reasons why spiritualism succeeded when it did. Something else I wanted to talk about was the difference between American and British spiritualism. There actually is a difference, believe it or not, but I'd like to start with American spiritualism since that's where it started. So with American spiritualism, it was predominantly young girls. Like I said, with Maggie and Katie Fox, who started spiritualism, it was 8 and 10 years old. 12, they weren't older than 13 when they started spiritualism, and it usually was influenced by their fathers. They would see these spiritualists in traveling shows and say, my child can do that too. And then they would start with their children as well, which is why most of these seances, spiritualism, all of these spectacles was in a public place, because they were still trying to make a buck. They were lower and lower middle class people trying to start this movement in America. And then there's sensationalism. Everybody knows P.T. Barnum and Barnum and Bailey Circus, but something maybe people don't know is P.T. Barnum was big on sensationalism. Broadcasting newspapers with huge gusto, let's try to even make up fake news to sell papers. So P.T. Barnum talked a lot about spiritualism in the beginning and helped boost the idea of spiritualism in the community. And then women's suffrage, believe it or not, if you have seen my live stream before, I talked about how women's suffrage and spiritualism went hand in hand in America. If you were a suffragist, you probably believed in spiritualism and vice versa. They helped each other out a lot. And as I said before, most came from lower class backgrounds. There were some upper class, but most of them in America were lower class. And then finally, in American spiritualism, it could be in rural and suburban areas. Rural areas actually did survive with spiritualism. In suburban areas, it was more popular, but it did happen in rural areas. British spiritualism. This is my wheelhouse, so I get more excited about this one. This one I could talk about all day. British spiritualism. So one of the things that inspired British spiritualism was medievalism. So the British believed, because they had Robin Hood and King Arthur in their background, that they were superior to everyone else, including in their history. So with medievalism, they believed that spiritualism started with them, and so their spiritualism was essentially better than American spiritualism. Most of it was women in the public space and men at home, which is interesting. If anybody knows about 19th century separate spheres ideology, women are usually in the home and men are in the public area. But in spiritualism in Britain, at least in my research, women were in the front. They were the face of spiritualism. They were spreading it, and men were at home working on domestic seances. So with British spiritualism, it was mostly strictly, I would say, all urban areas. The spiritualism movement did not succeed very well in rural areas because of witchcraft and cunning folk in the rural areas, but in suburban areas it succeeded very well. And something with the British spiritualism, unlike American, how P.T. Barnum, the sensationalism, people wanted to talk about spiritualism. In Britain, they did not. They thought it was crazy and they were ridiculous, and people got ridiculed. There was skepticism constantly. So there is a big difference between British and American spiritualism, which a lot of people don't know about, and I find absolutely fascinating. As you can see here, there are many types of seances. We're going to be talking about all of them. Each of these have a slide except manifestation, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that real quick. Manifestation was physical objects, people, smells, sounds coming out during a seance. So for example, a face manifestation was a spiritualist woman or man sitting at the seance, and all of a sudden their face would change to a person of color or to a different gender. Flowers would all of a sudden appear out of empty vases. Sometimes they would manifest fruit. If people asked for a gift, it usually was grapes, at least in British spiritualism. There was smells. One way that you knew a spirit was in the room was if there was a big smell of perfume. It was very strong, very pungent. Kind of like today, how in movies, in seances, it smells. It usually smells bad in movies, but in real life, it smelled really nice. And then the spirit manifestations was actual people that would appear. So the spiritualists would be sitting in their circle, and out of a area came another spirit that would come and talk to them, would touch them, hold them, even kiss them sometimes. So it's a really interesting, and it was the most popular form of spiritualism in the 1870s, and that's basically my area of research. So I know quite a bit, and it's pretty great. So first we have automatic writing, a very interesting part of seances. You use the planchette. Now the planchette is part of Ouija boards today, but originally the planchette was its own device. If you see in the very first picture, that's a planchette, and they would put a pencil on it and use your hands like touching with the alphabet you do today. But then the spirits would write messages through the planchette. Then you had slates. So the slates would be rubbed together, and when they moved them out, there was a message from a spirit on it. And then you had spirit boards, which, Ouija boards, and we'll talk about that too. The second picture is actually how they would do automatic writing all of a sudden appear on a card. If you see the guy's finger, it's being stabbed into his finger, so it goes under his nail, and I guess maybe the blood comes out and he writes with that, but I thought it was a really interesting image. Spirit boards. Everybody knows spirit board, Ouija boards. They're called talking boards. They're all kinds of boards. I call them spirit boards. Ouija board was a type of board, so I don't call it Ouija. It also was a board in the later 19th century, and spirit boards actually started in the 1860s. So on the very top is the original Ouija board that I was telling you about. And then the bottom was just a really interesting art. Ouija mania was during the 1920s. Once the Ouija board became really popular during World War I, everybody was using it. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about Ouija boards, spirit boards, why they're not dangerous. So a spirit board essentially was to talk to your loved one. If your mother or your father passed away in a war or pandemic or something, you would want to talk to them, and that's who would come out. You didn't never, in any of my research, did I see an evil spirit come out or anyone attack anybody or possession or anything like that. It was a celebration of life. Trance seances were the most popular form of spirit communication because it was so easy for spiritualists to do. If you look at the gentleman on the left, essentially a person would fall asleep or go into a trance and then become a different person. So, for example, when we talk about Cora Hatch in a little bit, she would go into a trance and then become a man and talk about spiritualism in lectures. So it was a really easy form of communication that a lot of spiritualists used because of how easy it was to become a spirit. Table tipping and rapping. So we talked a little bit about rapping with Maggie and Katie Fox. Table rapping was essentially you would ask the spirit a question, a yes or no question, and then the spirit would commit a series of noises. They called them raps. And it was rap once for yes, twice for maybe, undecided, not sure, something like that. And then 3 was for no. And what we found out with Maggie and Katie Fox later, Maggie admitted that she had a deformity in her toe that made her toe disjointed so she could make those noises with her toe. And that's how she made the rap noises. And then we have table tipping, as you see there. A spiritualist would have a hook on their dress or their waist, and when they stood up, the table would go with them. There was an interesting way that they believed the spirits were talking to them if the table moved. We had music in seances. Music was very prevalent in seances. We had instruments. They would set instruments on the table and have a dark seance. A dark seance was when it was completely pitch dark. There was no light anywhere. And they would set the instruments down on the table, and the table would, all of a sudden, the instruments would levitate and play around the room. There was also instruments in manifestations that I was telling you about, which we'll talk about with the spirit cabinets. Then there was also hymns. Apparently, the spirits would create their own hymns through the medium, and then the medium would write them down. Spiritualist churches existed and still exist today, and the spirits would write the music for the spiritualist churches. And then we had possession of the medium, not the scary possession. It was a possession, so they would go to sit at the piano, and then the spirit would be able to play an amazing song that the spiritualists didn't even know how to play piano before. So they would be possessed by the spirit to play something for their group in their seance. We have medicinal, which I find very interesting. If you see the gentleman on the bottom with the child, so essentially they would touch these people in the seance and cure their ailments. There was also magnets were very popular. You'd rub magnets on somebody, or like Dr. Mack in Britain, he used magnetized fabric, so he'd wrap the fabric around you to heal you. Dr. Mack was a very famous spiritualist in Britain. I find very interesting. He was charged in the Heresy Act. One of 3, I think, spiritualists that were charged in the Heresy Act because he was caught committing fraud 3 times as a spiritualist, and yet he still succeeded in becoming a very prominent spiritualist in the London community for years afterwards. He's a very interesting guy, and he's also not a doctor. Business seances. I know, business. So you actually, believe it or not, went to a spiritualist, and the spiritualist would become possessed by a spirit, and the spirit would give them financial advice. So on the top there is a newspaper clipping that I cut out from one of the 1870s newspapers, where a woman was possessed by a Native American spirit and told this gentleman, be careful in investing in this financial opportunity because it might not work out, as a Native American spirit knew his financial troubles. Then there was Mr. Towns, was also a prominent spiritualist in Britain. He was if you see, he was a medical spiritualist, and he was a business clairvoyant. So he was also one of these, but he wasn't possessed by a spirit or taken over. He was just asked the spirits questions, and they would give them financial advice. And then the picture on the bottom we have here is Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon. Everybody knows Cornelius Vanderbilt had the largest amount of wealth in the 19th century at that time period. He used spirits to help with financial advice and medical advice, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we have spirit cabinets. This was the most popular form, as I talked about, in the 1870s. A spirit cabinet was created by the Davenport brothers, as you see there in the picture. The Davenport brothers would tie themselves up in a cabinet that they constructed themselves, and they would tie themselves up. And they would sit in the cabinet with musical instruments, and suddenly the instruments would levitate, come out of the cabinet, and play for these people that were sitting in the audience. It was a huge form of manifestation that actually spread to Britain, and spirit cabinets were the most popular because, for once, people could see spirits coming out, could see them, could hear them, could talk to them, could touch them, unlike automatic writing and planchettes and such, where they just heard what was going on. And then the cabinets here would be made of different structures like wood, but if they were all of a sudden wanting to do a manifestation seance and they didn't have a cabinet, they would use an easel and then cover it with canvas or green baize. For those of you who don't know, because I didn't know either, green baize is the fabric they use for billiard tables. So they would cover it with baize, and then the medium would sit behind it, and the spirit would come out from behind the baize or the canvas. Ectoplasm is kind of gross. People might want to look away. Every time I talk about it, people get grossed out. Ectoplasm is not like you see in Ghostbusters. It was all women, and it was kind of a sexual thing. Women would be able to, so essentially the spiritualists would swallow cheesecloth that had egg whites and then magazine clippings of different women. So when they regurgitated it, the spirit would be coming out of their mouths, or as you see here in other different areas, like up there with Mina Crann, it came out of her ear. But in later 19th century, it came out of other areas, other lady areas. And it was only women did ectoplasm, and I think it's because it was symbolized kind of like a birth coming out. I have not seen any men actually do this, and I don't really know why they would swallow these things, but it became very popular in the 19th century. Sometimes they would use gloves, or even Mina Crann once used a chicken foot that came out of places, and then they used rubber gloves that they would just set on the table like the spirit hand came out of them. So it's very, very interesting, and like I said, not like Ghostbusters at all. So something to think about is why women? Something to think about is women. Why were women chosen as mediums? What made them the most popular, the most trustworthy? So we have American spiritualist Andrew Jackson Davis. He was one of the most famous spiritualists during the 19th century. He claimed that men and women had magnetic charge, that men had the positive charge. They were too intelligent and too masculine to be mediums. The spirits would only come out and talk to people who were maternal, delicate, and sensitive, the negative charge. So during a seance, they would have men on one side of the table and women on the other, and they were conductive to each other, creating a spirit or a larger, better connection. This is something Andrew Jackson, as far as I know, came up with, but it continued throughout the 19th century. Like I said, with electricity and things, it was just something they didn't understand and they wanted to make sense of, so they just went with this in women in spiritualism. So this is why mostly women were spiritualists, was because of their negative charge. Victoria Woodhull. If anybody doesn't know, Victoria Woodhull is one of my favorite people. She is controversial in some ways, but mostly she was an amazing woman. She ran for president 3 times, with her running mate being Frederick Douglass. She was a magnetic healer for Cornelius Vanderbilt. She claimed that she could cure his syphilis. He gave her over $100,000 in Victorian money, and she used that money to build the first women's stock brokerage on the New York Stock Exchange. She was an incredible woman, and she used spiritualism to further the suffrage movement. She knew it wasn't real. She didn't try to claim that it was, other than to get money from Cornelius Vanderbilt. And eventually, when her sister almost married Cornelius Vanderbilt, they took that money and moved to Britain. So she was an amazing woman. You should really read up on her. I love her. Cora Tappan, or she also was Cora Hatch, Cora Richmond. She was an interesting lady. She was a trance medium from childhood, so trance, as we talked about, where they would essentially fall asleep and become a different spirit. She was a trance medium from childhood, so I think she was 9 or 10 years old when she started with her father. And then her husband, she married her husband at, unfortunately, 13 and became a spiritualist with him. He became her manager. Then she got married 3 more times, which is kind of a big deal during the Victorian period. People did not get divorced, and yet it was okay for her to get divorced because she was so respected in the spiritualist community. So that's a picture of her, and she's known as like the most beautiful spiritualist during the Victorian period. She also traveled the world with her third husband as a spiritualist preacher. She was a woman and a preacher in a church and just couldn't get over it. She's also really interesting, and I think she might be a genius or really, really smart. If you read any of her lectures, she was an incredible speaker. And then we have Mina Crann. Mina Crann was an early 20th century spiritualist. She was the one that started Ectoplasm. That's a picture of her there. Those are stereoscopes, those 3D viewers. So you saw in 3D her regurgitating spirits. Anyway, so she was a physical medium. There weren't that many of those. She was a physical medium in the late 19th century, early 20th. And she would channel the spirit of Walter Stinson, which was her brother. And so when she regurgitated a spirit, it usually was her brother coming out. She also performed nude. If you can Google it if you want. She just was an interesting woman because in the 1920s, she was performing nude in front of men in a domestic space, so in a private area. She was a very interesting woman, as we'll talk about in the next slide as well. So Mina Crann and Harry Houdini had a rivalry / friendship, kind of. Houdini was a magician, that's true, but his life work was debunking spiritualist mediums like Mina Crann. He used to do seances in his magic acts, and when his mom passed away, he realized how bad and how scarring that could be to someone who just lost a loved one. So he spent the rest of his life going to medium seances and debunking them. He did want to believe, he wanted to know that there were spirits out there, but he just couldn't find them. And then Mina Crann came along, and Mina Crann was determined to convert Houdini. She said if anybody could, it would be her. So she was going to use this ectoplasm and spirit bells to convince him that spiritualism was real. Houdini did not want to go with this. He didn't think it was ever going to happen, so he actually went to the Scientific American magazine and said he would give them $1,000 if he could not prove Mina Crann was a fraud. And that's when he proved she was a fraud. He published a pamphlet called Marjorie the Medium Exposed, and this image on the bottom is actually one of the images used in the pamphlet. It's Mina Crann in there with a guest, and then on the right is Harry Houdini. So the spirit was supposedly supposed to ring a bell, once for yes, 3 times for no. And it just all of a sudden would appear during a dark seance. Well, Houdini realized that Mina Crann had a box underneath her chair, and she would use that and tap her foot to answer the questions. And he could feel it with his leg. You see his pants leg is pulled up there. It's because he felt when she was moving her foot. So he actually exposed her. And the spirit box today, you can actually go to Lilydale. It's the largest spiritualist community in America. It's actually on display there. So it's a really interesting piece. And I just find Harry Houdini and Mina Crann's relationship very interesting. It was kind of like are they friends? Are they not? Did he dislike her? Did he respect her? What was going on there? Florence Cook was the most popular woman spiritualist in the 1870s. She used spirit cabinets as well. She would manifest as Katie King. That is her on the bottom. That was her as Katie King. So she would go into the cabinet as, let's say, the picture on top. She would be dressed like that. And then she would go in the cabinet, and a spirit would come out, and it would be a different person, and this was Katie King. Katie King is in multiple newspapers throughout the decades, and she was a different person practically every decade. One decade, she was a Jamaican slave love child. And another decade, she was Henry Morgan's daughter. And another, she was his wife. So it just depended on the decade. But Katie King essentially attached herself to Florence Cook. So for 3 years, Florence Cook and Katie King stuck together, and they would do seances together, and she would come out and perform for the audience. And Florence Cook only did seances in the domestic space. She never did public seances. An interesting thing I think everyone will appreciate is she married L.G. Corner, and the way she did it was she was Katie King in a seance, sat in his lap and asked him to marry her, and he said he would, and so they actually got married. So essentially he married Katie King, but they stayed married for the rest of their lives, so maybe he just tolerated her after he married her. I don't know. It's just really interesting. And then there was a scandal with Sir William Crookes. He was a scientist in the 19th century. He spent, I think, a year working with Florence Cook on the scientific research behind the way she could manifest as Katie King. The scandal was that she was staying at his house when she was unmarried, and he was married, and they had a love affair. And this is why he did not see through her and see what she was doing and that she was committing fraud, because he was in love with her. And then something to also think about is when I was talking about British spiritualism and how all of them were upper class women. Florence Cook was not upper class. She was lower class. She was like a little kid, like I said, with her parents in Hackney. And she was not wealthy at all, but because of spiritualism, she actually became one of the most wealthy spiritualists in Britain. Agnes Guppy Volkman. Agnes Guppy was an infamous medium. She was manifestation as well, but she didn't manifest spirits. She manifested the objects I was telling you about, such as fruit, the smells, the flowers, stuff like that. So there's an infamous levitation occurrence that happened that you can read about in any book at all. It's Mrs. Guppy Takes Flight, essentially. So there was a seance at the home of C.E. Williams in Britain at 61 Lambs Conduit Street. Don't ask me how I know that. And then Ms. Guppy was at home just doing embroidery. And at the seance, C.E. Williams had evoked the spirit John King, Katie King's husband or whoever at that time period. And he said that he wanted to prove his powers to them. So he actually put Agnes Guppy on the table and set her down with her embroidery hoop, and she was just sitting there. This is the infamous levitation occurrence that afterwards she got up and levitated on the table and actually levitated back to her house. It's really hard to believe, even if you want to believe in ghosts and spiritualism and levitation, that she would go from the city area where Fleet Street, the Strand, all that over there, all the way to the West End without ever being seen. It's maybe 2 or 3 miles just floating along there. It's a very famous thing. Arthur Conan Doyle believed her. William Crookes believed her. All of these famous, prominent spiritualists believed her, and nobody ever figured out if she actually did it. So she was very jealous of Florence Cook. She was a little older if you see her up there. She didn't start as a child. She started as an adult, and she was very jealous of Florence Cook's success. So very interesting, when her husband, Mr. Guppy, passed away, she married Mr. Volkman, and Mr. Volkman actually caught Florence Cook as a fraud. And I think maybe they had a connection together because she appreciated that he caught her. I'm not really sure, but it was very interesting that she went on to marry the guy that defrauded her. And then we have Frederick Hudson. He was the British spirit photographer. So spirit photography actually started in America and it didn't come over to Britain for a couple years, but when it did, it came with Frederick Hudson, and he and Agnes Guppy actually started spirit photography in Britain. Now, he got caught, and she did not, and I don't really know why. There isn't much about it, but she was one of the reasons why spirit photography became so prevalent in Britain at the period. So for those who don't know, spirit photography is where the person would take a photo, and then because they were taking a photo with the spirit, maybe even in a seance, the spirit would be behind them or sitting next to them or touching them. It was a way to show the person that their loved one was still with them. So a famous picture we'll show you in a little bit is Mary Todd Lincoln in a spirit photography with Abraham Lincoln is behind her. So I'll show you that in a little bit. Catherine Barry and Georgiana Houghton were spirit painters. Essentially, they would put their paintbrush on the canvas, and the spirit would paint for them. These 2 paintings here are by Georgiana Houghton. I wish we had some of Catherine Barry's because she actually is in my thesis a lot. But these are spirit paintings that she actually debuted in London in the West End. And Catherine Barry had a gallery opening in Brighton, so it was a thing, and it was prominent at the time, these spirit drawings. Everyone wanted to see them. And then these 2 women were part of a trio. There was actually another woman. Her name was Sophia de Morgan. These 3 were never debunked during the spiritualism period, and they were the 3 that started the spiritualism movement in London. So they're a very interesting trio, and they all have books. There's 2 here. Catherine Barry wrote My Experiences in Spiritualism, and Georgiana Houghton wrote Evenings at Home with a Spiritual Seance. Both of them are memoirs and recount different seances that were in their home, and they're absolutely fascinating. I highly recommend them. So who participated in these seances? It wasn't just spiritualists just performing for other spiritualists. So we have famous people like Mary Shelley believed her daughter was a medium herself at 8 years old. Did they do seances? I'm not really sure, but she did believe in spiritualism, which is interesting. And then Charles Dickens was a huge spiritualist. In fact, he became a spiritualist and did seances for his friends a couple of times in the newspaper. Bram Stoker his wife was a council member on the Theosophy Society. Theosophy was spiritualism and Hindu Buddhism combined together to create this new religion. and his wife was a council member on the Theosophical Society, so they did believe in spiritualism. And Arthur Conan Doyle was the biggest spiritualism supporter. There's Arthur Conan Doyle on the top doing spirit photography. We don't know who that lady is. Usually spirit photography is with a loved one. That is not one of his family members, so it could just be a random spirit that was supposed to be there. Arthur Conan Doyle actually quit writing Sherlock Holmes to focus completely on spiritualism and proving to everyone that it was real. It's rumored that this is because his son died in World War I and he wanted to see him again. There is no real reason. He doesn't specify it in his books, but it's one of the reasons why he became the largest spiritualism believer in Britain. And then you had Marie Curie and her husband both believed in spiritualism. Thomas Edison wanted to create a spirit phone where you would put your ear to the phone and talk to spirits. That obviously went really well. And then you have W.T. Stead. He was an editor, and he was actually on the Titanic when it sank. He's a very interesting man. If you want to read any of his works, he did Borderlands, this newspaper in Britain. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was a spiritualist, as I told you before. Suffragists were usually spiritualists and vice versa. So I believe Susan B. Anthony was also a spiritualist. It was just a very interesting period where women's rights in both ways went hand in hand. You're a spiritualist, and that made you a respected woman, and you were a suffragist, and that made you a respected woman. So here's that picture I was telling you about. There's Mary Todd Lincoln with Abraham Lincoln in the back. It's kind of faded, but I think you can see it pretty good. And there is a photograph by one of the original spirit photographers, William Mumler. Mary Todd Lincoln was a very, very big believer in spiritualism. After her son passed away, her and Abraham Lincoln actually had a seance at the White House to talk to their son. And then you had very interesting royal figures. You had Queen Victoria, which obviously she was trying to talk to Albert, of course, and the Imperial Highness of Russia, and the Earl of Crawford, the Baroness von Vey, the Countess of Caithness. You had Viscountess, you had Baronesses, you had all kinds of royalty believing in spiritualism, and that kind of made it okay. If a royal believed in it, then I guess it has to be real, because no royal would believe in something ridiculous, right? So it was an interesting time period, and most newspapers had some royal in an article talking about spiritualism. So what can we take away from women in spiritualism? Well, as I said before, it gave them respect in the community. Men gave them a voice. They were allowed, the separate spheres ideology at the time. They spent most of their time in the domestic sphere, becoming the head of the household, essentially doing all the chores, all that stuff. But when they were a spiritualist, men actually let them leave their homes and do God's work. So that was something that spiritualism gave to women, and it also gave them financial freedom. Anytime that they did a public or even sometimes domestic seances they would charge, they got to keep that money. So it was financial freedom from their husbands, or even if they were widows and they were losing money, they could make more. And they were able to travel alone. At that time, women weren't allowed to do anything by themselves. But as spiritualists, for some reason, it was okay. They did not have to have a partner with them, or a safety, or their husband or somebody with them when they traveled. I believe Emma Hardinge Britten, one of the famous spiritualists who did many, many, many lectures, toured the country by herself all the time, and also went to Britain many, many, many times. Something I wanted to touch on a little bit is the seance today. Seances, if you look at any movie, any TV show, anything with a seance, a woman is in charge. A woman's leading the planchette. The woman is planning it. It was the woman's idea to even play the game. It's always the woman's idea. And I think this comes from 19th century spiritualism, and that women were usually mediums, and that it just resonates today, and it just still continues with women in movies and things. So, for example, We have at the top is Host. It's a movie on Shudder I'd highly recommend. It's all women there having a seance actually online. That's the technology we're in today. And then you have Ouija in the middle, and that was run, if you see in the very middle, that's a girl there running the seance with a Ouija board trying to contact their friend. And then the very end is the most famous, The Exorcist, and Reagan uses the Ouija board and becomes possessed by a demon. So it's always women, as I said. If you look at a Ouija board, if you look at somebody performing a seance, it's going to be a woman. And I like I said, I think it's because of 19th century spiritualism. And something I wanted to remind you is there is a stigma about spiritualism and seances that they're evil, that if you touch them, something bad's going to happen to you. But, I mean, that's not what it was made for. And now, if it's a toy, how are you going to hurt someone with it? I think it's very important to remember that spirit boards were to talk to loved ones and make families feel whole again. So that is women and spiritualism in the 19th century. As you can tell, I'm very excited about it. It's my thesis. It's something I really enjoy in history, and I hope you enjoyed learning about it with me. Thank you for joining, and thank you for being a member. See you next time.